We're starting a new topic today, and that is the topic of Sohet. Sohet is the idea of squeezing juice out of a fruit. We're going to go into a variety of different laws that relate to it. I'm just going to mute on everyone. Feel free to unmute yourself. Okay, so what is this law of Sohet? So he says like this: HaSochet b'Shabbat zetim lasot mehem shemen, or anavim lasot mehem yain, hayav mishum mefarek, she tolada shemlechet dash. So first, we'll talk about the most serious of the concepts. So as we've done beforehand, we've talked about what's the milacha in the Torah. We've said there's 39 milachot that are asur from the Torah. We're not allowed to do these 39 actions, so things like writing or lighting a fire or other things that we've seen like planting a seed or plowing the ground. So one of the actions that is taken in order to make bread is called dash. Dash is literally threshing. And what does threshing mean? So when we have wheat, it grows on these stalks and there's husks around them and so on. We cut them down, we take them out of their husks, but even when they're in their husks, they're in a hard shell, and we kind of want the inside of what's on the hard shell. And one of the things that we do is to stomp down on them and crush them and take out what's inside. So that is what is forbidden of the melacha. That's the basic melacha that's in the Torah, is to crush. And we don't do it with our hands. They have some kind of board or mortar or heavy stone that pushes down on it, cracks the wheat, and the inside comes out. Okay, so that's the basic melacha. Now, a tolada, which means a byproduct, a kind of a subcategory, is something called mifarek. What does mifarek mean? Not using wheat, but using some kind of fruit, actually two very specific types of fruit, where our goal is not the fruit itself, but actually the juice of the fruit is the main idea. And there's two fruits that are very primary in the Torah, in the land of Israel, in the way the world worked, where the fruit is kind of secondary to its juice, meaning in general, we grow a fruit, but we don't really want the fruit. We want the juice that the fruit produces. And what, of course, are these two very important things in the Torah? And number one is olives. Number two is grapes, right? We like olives, we like grapes, but they're not what they're for, right? Meaning, why do we grow grapes primarily, certainly in the Torah, right? Why do we grow grapes? For the juice, for the wine that comes out of it, right? Why do we grow olives? For the oil that comes out from it, not for the olive itself, right? But rather for the oil that comes out of it. So these two items, which are unique amongst fruits in this way, the main purpose for growing them is for the purpose of the juice. So if I were to squeeze out those items, those fruits, for the juices that are in them, then from the Torah, I have violated the melacha of dash. I have basically done another version of dash, which was, as we said, taking the grain of wheat out of the larger piece, right? So same thing, if I squeeze a grape to get its juice, or I squeeze an olive to get its oil, so that is a problem. And so those are things that are not allowed, and they're asur from the Torah. Now, by extension, he talks about berries or pomegranates. He says pomegranates and berries, their primary purpose is to eat them as fruit. However, the Chachamim saw that even though the primary purpose is as fruit, very often people will squeeze those for juice, either the pomegranates or the berries or something like that. It says, and since it's not the primary thing, it's only the secondary thing, but yet it's still something that is not uncommon, it's asur midrabanan, meaning it's not the same high level isur as olive oil and juice from grapes, but it's still forbidden midrabanan, and therefore we would not be allowed to do it. Since some people do this, we don't want one thing to lead to the next, and we don't want to get to the isur of people squeezing grapes or people squeezing olives. So therefore, even berries, even pomegranates, one may not squeeze for their juice on Shabbat. Good, everyone with me so far? Not too complicated. Okay, he says now, since this is the case, he says, Kol Puri, shenohagim be'ezem makom lesochato l'shtot memav machmat sameh ot anut. He says, any fruit that in any place that the general concept is that people squeeze it in order to get its juices because they're thirsty and they want to drink, or because it's enjoyable to drink it. Especially since in that place there's a lot of those fruits. In the rest of the world, we keep the law even, and therefore, since in some places they drink it this way, in all places you can't squeeze it. So what fits into this category? So the first case that he brings is an interesting case, which we usually don't do. He says, "V'lachen asur l'schot agasim." He says you can't squeeze out pears. Right? I've never had pear juice. I don't know, maybe any of you, maybe some of you had, but in general, around here, pear juice, it's not a thing, right? He says, so because in some places, people squeeze these things out and have pear juice. I have no idea where, but wherever they do, they do. Since that's the case, in New York, in Jerusalem, in wherever, you also can't squeeze the pear, because when you squeeze the pear, you're going to get the juice, and some people do that. So since some people do that, out. Okay. Something that we do find much more common in our parts. He says the same thing is true of apples. Right? In America, apple juice is a big deal, right? If you have young kids, right, they love the apple juice, right? In schools, they love to give the kids apple juice. It gives them a little extra jolt of sugar, and it keeps them awake and going, right? You got to be careful when applied, but that's basically, apple juice. We're all familiar with apple juice. It's not true everywhere in the world, right? Not everywhere do they drink apple juice, but since apple juice is a thing, you can't squeeze the apple to get the juice. He says, and for sure, right, what's a juice that people drink? Orange juice, right? It's huge, right? Orange juice is tremendous. Ashkoliot, grapefruit juice, same thing. Because people in a lot of places squeeze out oranges and grapefruits for their juices. He says, and so too, he even says tomatoes, right? Tomato juice is a pretty common item, right? I think they call it V8 or whatever the version of it is. He says the same thing. Since there's a lot of people squeeze tomatoes, you can't squeeze tomatoes for its juice unless there's going to be an exception, which we're going to get to in a minute. But basically, he's going to say you can't squeeze these things. So I don't know what else we could think of, right, that fits into this category of a fruit that they squeeze for a juice.
Lemons?
What's that?
Lemons. Like those.
We're going to get to lemons. Lemons. We're going to get to. So lemons has its own special law, which we're going to talk about. So lemons is an exception to what we're saying. But yes, lemons would be something. What other fruits is a common fruit that you could think of that people make juice out of? Thinking of smoothie.
Prune juice.
Prunes, yeah,
Cranberry juice.
Cranberries for sure. Right? Cranberries is berries. Yeah.
Carrot.
So carrots, I don't know if they use them as juices or the carrots are pureed, which is a different story. But because like you can't squeeze a carrot and get juice out of it, can you? I don't think you can.
Yeah, by machine. But
right, you got to puree it. Okay, so that's not what we said. Okay, so hold on. Let's go a little further. Well, you get the basic idea of what we're talking about, right? The idea is, right, the Torah law was that they squeezed or they crushed the kernel out of the wheat, right? So now we said, so by extension, you weren't allowed to squeeze juice out of grapes or olives, right? Those were the two primary things, which in general, that's what they grow them for. Now we've extended it, midrabanan, to things that they don't necessarily grow it for that, but since it's so around, people tend to squeeze it for juice, and so therefore it's not. The truth is, by the way, I would argue that I'm not going to say this, but oranges at this point are grown depending on where you are. But in Florida, right, oranges are grown primarily for orange juice. They are not grown for eating, as opposed to California, where oranges are grown primarily for eating and they're not grown for orange juice. Why that's the case, I'm not exactly sure, but this used to be the case, and I'm not sure if it still is. But if you look it up, you'll find that different places grow oranges for different purposes. But Florida is primarily for orange juice, whereas California is primarily for the fruit. Okay. He says, let's say you have a fruit that they don't squeeze in any real place as a matter of practice. That type of fruit you're allowed to squeeze out even for its juice, right? Since that's the case. So like, what would be a case? So he gives an example. He says, he says you could squeeze a watermelon. Right? Watermelon is generally not used for juicing, although the truth is you could argue today. But watermelon is by and large not for its. It's eaten as a fruit. It's not really a place where that's like you make watermelon juice. So therefore, it would not be a problem to squeeze out watermelon juice. Another thing that I'd be wondering is maybe like a kiwi. Like kiwis, do people really squeeze them for juice? I don't think so. So you kind of have to establish, do people squeeze them out for juice in a particular place? Doesn't mean does anyone ever do it, right? Because obviously you're doing it, so it's, sometimes someone does it. It means, is it like a thing somewhere, right? Like orange juice is a thing, right? And pomegranate juice is a thing, right? But and cranberry juice and so on. But kiwi juice, I don't know. Although one of the top Snapple flavors for a while was kiwi strawberry, so perhaps I'm wrong about that. But I think that's not really, that's an artificial thing. That's not really kiwi, and I don't know. I don't think people use kiwis as juices, but I don't know. But I would say, a good question, which I think would be a problem, would be mangoes, right? Mangoes, I think they squeeze them for juices, but I'm not positive, because mangoes might be the type of thing like Nathan said, where they don't squeeze them, then they puree them, which may be a different problem. But for now, we'll say that mangoes are probably a problem one way or another, because I think people do use mango juice. Okay. He says, of course, all this is talking about a squeezer that's non-electric, right? If you're using an electric squeezer, okay, so there's a different problem, which is the electricity. Okay, next. Mutar limtzotz b'fiv hamitz shebaperot kigon tutim v'rimonim tapuchei zahav v'ashkaliyot. He says, even though we said you can't squeeze things out for fruit, for juice, that means like into a cup, right? But let's say I take a berry in my mouth and I squeeze it, right? And then drink the juice out of it and then chuck the berry out. It says that's allowed, right? So you can't squeeze it with your hand or a utensil, but to go straight into your mouth, to squeeze it into your mouth, meaning with your teeth in your mouth, then it's not a problem, and that's okay. He says you can squeeze out in your mouth the juice from meat. You can squeeze out if you've dipped a cookie or a piece of bread into wine or a soup or something like that, no problem. All going to be okay. Now, the next idea that he talks about here is mutar l'schot afilu eshkol shel anavim letoch ochel kedei letaken et tama ochel. He says, let's say you're not squeezing it into a cup to make juice, but you're squeezing it onto a food or into a food product in order to have it as an ingredient in the food. He says you're allowed to do that. So even to take grapes, right, which we said you're not allowed to do for grape juice, but let's say you have something that the grapes are good over, right? So if you could squeeze the grapes over the food, and the grapes will go into the food, that's okay. So maybe another example of this might be to squeeze the olive oil into a food, right? So you need some olive oil to squeeze the olive into the food is okay. He says, and this is true even if you're not sitting and eating it right now, you're like preparing it to be in a little while, that's okay. So that's something that you're allowed to do. He says, however, don't play games with this, right? Like what might someone want to do? He'll take a little bit of sugar and put it in the bottom of a cup and then squeeze oranges onto it and say, oh, look, there's food in the cup, so I'm not really making juice. No, it means that the majority of what's going to be is going to be a solid, is going to be a food, and that you're squeezing into it. But if it's the majority is going to be the juice that you're squeezing, or you're squeezing into a liquid, right? Because if you're squeezing into a liquid, that's also not okay, because you're basically just creating juice. So as long as it's not those two things, if it's into a solid, if it's into food, it'll be okay. Okay, now we get to lemons. And Ezra had brought up, what about lemons, right? Lemons, people squeeze for lemonade and so on. So it says lemons are allowed to be squeezed on Shabbat. They have a special law, right? You're allowed to squeeze lemons on Shabbat. It's considered lemons are not for drinking, even though some people do. The halacha by lemons is it's not a problem. He says you could squeeze it into a cup and so on. You could pour it into into food after. He says, if you're going to make lemonade, right? If you're going to fresh squeeze lemonade, so he says they have a recommendation, the way to do it. He says the way to do it is first put the sugar in the cup, then put the lemon, then put the extra water that you're going to do. And they actually have an acronym for doing this. Sulam Mutzav Arza. You may remember from Yaakov Avinu, it says the ladder was standing on the ground, right? So they use the word ladder, sulam, samach, lamed, mem, to tell you how to make lemonade. Samach, sukar, lamed, lemon, mem, mayim, right? So first put the sugar, then put the lemon, then put the water, and you're allowed to squeeze lemons, okay? So that's the way that you're allowed to squeeze lemonade on Shabbat, which is an interesting concept, because why should you be allowed to do that? Why are lemons different than oranges? But that's the understanding that they had. If it came to law, and that's what we do. And so therefore, there we go. Let me try and hurry up with this to just finish off these halachot so that we can get all of this. So we said before, and we'll just reiterate, that when squeezing lemons into tea, you have to be careful what kind of cup it is, right? You don't want to squeeze lemons into a kli rishon, because then the lemons, or even in a secondary utensil, the lemons are considered davar charif. They're spicy, and spicy things are considered things that cook easily. So when you squeeze the lemon into a cup, even in kli sheni, it's a problem. So what do I do, right? So what do I do? So they say put a little lemon into sugar, or put a lemon into a different cup, right? But you don't want to squeeze, or wait till the tea cools off a little bit, but you don't want to squeeze the lemon into very hot tea. Okay, next thing. It's not a problem, pickles, right? A lot of times we eat pickles, and pickles, the way they're made, they're put in a jar with a liquid. So you have these vegetables usually, or fruits, but it's usually vegetables, that are chock full. They're like brimming with these liquids that are like the salty liquids that were used to pickle it. It's not a problem to squeeze it or to bite it. No one drinks the pickle juice, and if you do, God bless you. But no one really drinks that, so it's not a problem. One fruit that they consider, you have to be so careful when you're cutting it that you're not squeezing it and using it for the juice, is grapefruits, right? For those who like to eat grapefruits, I'm one of them. You know that when you cut a grapefruit, like just by cutting it, because it takes a lot of pressure to cut it, and they're very juicy usually, so you're creating juice. So if it happens by accident and you're not making grapefruit juice, so no problem. But it's something to consider and to contemplate, that it could potentially be a problem. The last thing that I want to get to actually isn't fruit altogether or food. This area of Sohet comes into another area of halacha, another area that
Rabbi, just one sec. On the grapefruit, so at the end when you squeeze the grapefruit after you've eaten it, when you squeeze it, you should not be doing that on Shabbat, correct?
Not for the juice, for sure, not for the juice.
Okay.
So if you're eating it, that's fine, right? But
Right.
Right. So like I like to eat grapefruits, but to squeeze grapefruit juice, you're not allowed to do. If you like to drink grapefruit juice, you should not do that. And they even talk about, which if you're familiar with eating grapefruits, like out of the grapefruit with a spoon, a lot of
that's what I'm
times,
talking
like
about.
you scoop out the fruit, and then there's like all this juice that's there. Since that's the way we eat it, it's not really a problem. But you could see even that some people do say it could be an issue. The last thing I want to talk about, I want to get this in before we finish, is a sponge, right? A sponge or a wet wipe or something like that. So the Chachamim talk about the concern of squeezing that out and getting a juice out of it, and that being a problem. And so for this purpose, that you'll find that there's a lot of people that you can actually buy. There's a couple of solutions to this. Number one is if the sponge has some kind of handle, it's fine. Number two, if there's a Shabbat sponge that they sell, which doesn't really absorb, so that would also be fine. Number three is if you're really careful with it. Number four is they say it doesn't really apply if it's a synthetic sponge, which today almost all of them are. So it's generally not a problem, but I would still advise that we don't use sponges on Shabbat unless we have a certain type of sponge. However, people who use wet wipes, right, which there's a lot of circumstances where we'll use wet wipes, that's okay. Also, moisturizing cloths or things like that, those are all going to be okay. We'll stop here with that, and tomorrow we'll talk about a new topic, which is grinding and grinding for flour, and then ultimately that'll lead us into kneading for dough, K-N-E-A-D, kneading for dough. So we're going to stop here with that, and we'll start the tefillah. Enjoy.